Greetings, Science of Sporters, and welcome to this 4-minute mull, which comes to you today not from Cape Town, but from London. I'm over here and in Dublin for the next couple of weeks, attending various workshops and meetings and presentations and conferences. And one of those conferences is actually in London tomorrow. It's a high-performance sports analysis conference, and I'm on a panel discussion talking about the application of of sports science to elite sport. And I guess as I was getting my mind ready for that discussion, I thought I would share with you a 4-minute mull on elite sports management and high performance strategies, specifically in the context of the Winter Olympics, which have just ended, and the discussion around funding for Olympic medals and how much is too much when it comes to spending money on those medals. So having been in London for the last week, I've had a front row seat to this discussion, because every day I'll pick up the paper or watch television and I'll see some people saying we need more money and some people saying that's ridiculous, you're spending too much money. I read about the £5.5 million spent for curling, the similar amounts in skeleton, in bobsled, in short track speed skating. And there's one camp, the don't spend the money camp, that are basically saying that ultimately that money is winning what is a worthless gold medal. Now, that's somewhat oxymoronic and maybe a little bit harsh. I mean, it's never completely worthless. But their argument is that you could spend that money in different ways where it would make a deeper and broader impact on the wider community. In other words, it's all good and well that we can win 2 or 3 medals in skeleton, but what good does that actually do us over the next 5 years, 10 years? On the other side are people who would argue that winning those medals is extremely important, and so therefore they should be funded because they employ people, athletes, coaches, and so forth. They inspire the next generation of athletes, and they cause people to take up the sport, driving sports participation higher. Now, I don't know enough detail about the data to be able to evaluate those two arguments, but what I will say is I've seen some surveys and some research that's been done, and I am highly skeptical that the medal-winning success of a handful of people once every 4 years is enough to drive a significant increase in participation that is sustainable. That's really important. I've no doubt that people who watch that are inspired enough to say that I would like to look into taking that sport up. And that's quite easy to do when that sport happens to be track and field or swimming, or say some kid who's watched the rugby sevens debut in the Summer Olympics back in 2016. Those people can go down to the school or club and they can probably take up that sport and start playing it with their friends under the guidance of their parents and teachers and peers and coaches. It's quite different when that sport happens to be bobsled or skeleton or aerial skiing. And so that's where I think the debate comes in, is that there's going to be different contexts and different circumstances. Now, I'm not disputing the fact that the success of athletes at the Olympic Games on this grand stage can be the trigger for someone to take the sport up. But you have to think of it, in my opinion, like a lever. And if you flick that lever and it's not connected to anything else, then you're just wasting time flicking it. It's useless. And so that's the problem that I think is often neglected, is that lever, that spark that might be ignited by seeing an athlete for 15 minutes once every 4 years will go nowhere unless the sport is also geared to channel the interest and make accessible the things that are required. And I've seen data suggesting that most people, and by most we're talking 9 out of 10, most people will take up and stick with the sport because of the immediate circle of influences. So that means parents, coaches, friends, and peers, and other family members. Those are the people who trigger us to participate in sport. And very few people, not none, there will be people in 12 years' time who will tell us that they took the sport up because they were inspired by watching it in 2018 in South Korea. So I'm not relegating it to zero, but I would say that on the spectrum of levers and opportunities that we have to invest funds, you're far better off putting that funding towards the participation of people at the levels that they actually engage in than trying to trigger someone who then has to start a multiple step journey just to be able to do that sport. And so that's why I'm sympathetic to arguments that are saying that how can basketball receive nothing when it has potentially vast community reach in terms of participation, whereas skeleton and these other sports are receiving all that money. Again, I'm not here to offer you answers, that's my opinion. I can speak from the South African context and say that just as a dose of perspective, our entire sports budget over 4 years is less than the budget of some single sports in Great Britain in 1 year. In other words, if I take some of the more heavily funded summer sports like rowing and cycling and canoeing and track and field and swimming, those individual sports are getting more money in 1 year than our entire sporting system over 4. And that's just our lot in life. Now, the sports scientist in me would love for us to have more money, because that's the money that would employ people like me and my colleagues and doctors and coaches and physios and other clinicians. It would be wonderful to have an army or a body of people who are employed in sport, because the consequence is our intellectual capital in sport would increase, and that would be a good thing. However, given in South Africa we're dealing with crises of healthcare and employment and social inequalities and infrastructure, it would be unbelievably reckless for us to take that much money, 200-300 million rand, which works out to being 15-20 million pounds, and putting that money into something that benefits 1% of the population. You know, the people are happy when we win Olympic medals. There's a great feeling of pride and national satisfaction the day after an Olympic gold medal is won. But a week later, that feeling is gone. And so it's much like the participation. You can ignite the spark, but if that spark doesn't have something to run along, it disappears very quickly. And that's the problem, I think. And so, final analogy just to leave you with is, imagine you're the parents of a kid at school and you get a letter from that school and says, "Dear Mr. and Mrs. So-and-so, we've decided as a school board that we're going to spend £1.5 million upgrading our school sports infrastructure. We're going to build a state-of-the-art gymnasium, an indoor swimming pool, and we're going to renovate our artificial fields." Now, if your child is one of that school's best athletes with potential for scholarships and a professional career, you would be delighted with that. You wouldn't question it for a second, because your child is about to go from here to here in terms of facilities and resources. On the other hand, if your child is not, or if you've got other kids, you would look at that and say, but the school's computer laboratory is 10 years out of date. It doesn't have a functioning library, and it needs about 3 or 4 staff members. So could we not spend that money there? And that's kind of the analogy. Where would you put yourself on that spectrum? Now, I think it's good that countries have this debate. Every single country needs to think about issues like this. And again, I'm not here to tell you where on that spectrum from no spending, which I would disagree with, to maximum spending, which I also disagree with. Somewhere in the middle is where you need to be. And that is unique to every single country. And the reason it's unique to every country is because there are political, geographical, environmental, social, economic, and cultural factors that influence where sport needs to sit on that list, on that spectrum. And equally, not just where it needs to exist, but what kind of return you get. And so that's an analysis every single country needs to do. And I know where South Africa sits on it. I wouldn't profess to say where GB sits on it, but I think it's an important discussion that needs to be had, and I look forward to seeing how the discussion is resolved when the funding figures are announced for your next cycle. Anyway, Elite Sports Conference is tomorrow. I'm sure that will trigger some other thoughts, and that I will therefore be back later this week with another 4-minute mull on where sports science fits in this whole high-performance landscape. So do join me then. Ciao.